You know, all our gardens are in full swing, and we have, if you have some blank spots in your garden, there is still time to direct sow some seeds. So if you have like to put in some bush beans or some squash or basil or dill, you could put in some marigolds or some sunflowers even. So if you do need some seeds, you know, we're here to help. So please stop by the Black Mountain Library and check out our seed table. Afterwards, you know, take some time to relax and check out some of the books that we have at the library too. And the Friends of the Library have their books for sale. So look to see what they have. And speaking of sales, the Friends of the Library will be having a book sale next Saturday on June 19th from 10 to 2 under the big tent at the Black Mountain Library. So that's something else to look forward to for next week. For our July presentation, we are going to be having John Bowen back. He is the Buncombe County Master Gardener volunteer, and he is going to be teaching a propagation class. He's going to demonstrate a few simple steps for taking stem cuttings and to propagate some of your favorite annual and perennial shrubs. It's easy to do, and this workshop will be on July 10th at 10 a.m. and we'll be doing it through Zoom again. So our seed library is always looking for donations. If you've got some extra seeds, just drop them off at the Black Mountain Library. Now on to the presentation. Everyone is on mute, so if you have any questions, please type them into the Q&A. Lisa will be taking questions towards the end of the session. We will be recording this presentation and we'll have it posted to our library YouTube channel. And when it's available, I'll send you the link. Yesterday, I had emailed all the handouts out to everybody that registered. And if you didn't receive one, just please let me know. So on to the workshop. I'm so pleased to introduce Lisa Wagner. Lisa was the Director of Education at the South Carolina Botanical Garden at Clemson University for 20 years. A plant ecologist by background, she has a PhD in botany at UC Berkeley, and she's interested in native plants, sustainable gardening, public education, and promoting habitat restoration, as well as being a passionate gardener. She now does frequent presentations and classes as a volunteer on a variety of topics. She has a blog called The Natural Gardening, and it reflects her observations about gardening and the natural world. Lisa and her husband now live part-time in Asheville, where they're surrounded their house with native plantings, including pocket meadows. They also spend time in Northern Appalachian in their cottage in Quebec, where they've also been actively converting a horticultural landscape to a natural one. Welcome, Lisa, to our sewing circle, and I'll turn this over to you.
Thank you, Lyndall. And it's so nice to share some time this morning with all of you out there. I can't see your names, but I know you're out there, a nice group. And it's a wonderful topic to spend some time on today. I also love vegetable gardening, so I encourage all of you that are doing that too. And I'll start here by doing my screen share and getting my presentation started. Okay, here we go. Let me try again here. I accidentally inserted a slide instead of turning this into my presentation. Now, pocket meadows have been on my mind for quite a while, and pocket is a relative term. They can be very small to relatively large to even fairly expansive perennial plantings. This shows the front of a pocket meadow that I had down in Clemson. It was not teeny, it was actually pretty large, and you can see how it enhanced the front of our garage there. This is the pocket meadow in front of our house here in Asheville a couple of summers ago in mid to late July, early August. What the idea is, and this may not look pockety to you either. It started out much smaller, it's gotten larger, it ebbs and flows over the seasons and the time of the year, and what appears through self-sowing and what disappears through random senescence or whatever. Usually random senescence is what it's about. So
Excuse me,
here,
Lisa.
yeah.
Hi, we can't see your slides. So if you could share them again, we'd really appreciate it.
Okay, let me start over then.
Sorry about that.
Well, yeah. I'm assuming you can see my screen now.
Yes.
Okay. Well, here's what I was talking about. You could hear me talk about this first on my Piedmont pocket meadow in front of our garage there that was quite extravagant. It was large. It replaced a very scruffy lawn that had a privet in the middle. That went away, and over time was really very, very diverse, although common milkweed sort of took over towards the end of our time there. This is the pocket meadow in front of our house here in Asheville in midsummer to late summer when it's really at its peak. Right now it's really pretty, but what is largely in flower is penstemons, and some other plants are just coming along. So in pocket is in the eye of the beholder, whether you have a large landscape or a small landscape. If you Google container meadows, you'll get some wonderful examples of containers planted with meadow mix assortments of seeds, and they can be lovely too. So you can evoke the feeling of a meadow in a large or small landscape. Another way to think about this is that as vignettes, that we arrange plants in small spaces to evoke some other sort of habitat or landscape. And in this case, these informal perennial borders create this meadow effect, a very informal border. A look at the Piedmont meadow in fall when the light was hitting that Indian grass. You can see in this particular image, there was still plenty of space here and the common milkweed hadn't totally taken it over yet. In progress, it started out looking like something like this, and its best year, this was a privet I mentioned, that was privet. This was a nasty little shrub rose, scruffy grass that turned into this meadow in probably its best summer when we had abundant rain. We can tuck meadows into many individual spaces. Here's something that has a meadow-ish aspect to it with a bit of a border surrounded by a parking lot and back. And we might want to ask the question as we think about creating meadows is, really, what's a meadow? Meadows are not natural habitats except in very specific circumstances. They're natural, but they're disturbance maintained. They're either by grazing, by fire, or in a human garden maintained by us. The gardener edits, the gardener bush hogs, the gardener weed whacks, the gardener clips. So meadows are really more akin to prairies, which were maintained historically by buffalo grazing and fire. And where we are in the Blue Ridge province, our meadows are all disturbance maintained. At one point, they were maintained by fire. William Bartram wrote about seeing indigenous peoples setting fires in the Piedmont, partially in the mountains, to maintain meadows. Here's a meadow that we visited many, many years ago that was in Switzerland. So maintained by cattle grazing, dairy cows, unbelievably diverse because of that. Here's a rocky scree meadow in Oregon, also not quite as diverse, but you can see how really delightful it was. And these are the sorts of habitats that I've always wanted to evoke, and we're seeing it more and more. And in both in our natural landscapes and during this pandemic year, I've seen a lot of people using meadow mixes to create little meadowy patches, or maintaining, letting their lawns get a little bit shaggy here in No Mow May in the last month, and looking really quite delightful. Here is a fire maintained meadow in Apalachicola National Forest in northern Florida in the Panhandle, another wonderfully diverse kind of meadow habitat. At the North Carolina Arboretum, there's a really nice meadow habitat below the big statue of Frederick Law Olmsted. They call it the Forest Meadow. And simply put, it says a meadow is an opening within a forest, and they're mixing up, once an opening is established, a lot of self-sowing through grasses and wildflowers take root, but then of course they're replaced by woody trees and shrubs as succession proceeds. And what I like to always emphasize in the programs that I do is that plants are a changing medium. Plants and gardens are always changing. This is a little planting, not a meadow planting, next to our front walkway. And it's changed so much over the time that we've owned this house and gardened here. And it's important, particularly with meadows and perennials, to keep this in mind. They don't stay the same. And I want to give you some idea. And I started out 20 years ago actually working with establishing what we called Piedmont prairies or native Southeastern meadows. These were massive undertakings, very, very often very challenging. Having a smaller meadow is a much easier thing to think about. I have people ask me quite a bit, how do I convert my lawn to a meadow? And I'll come back to how we can create these meadows towards the end of the program. Some of the inspirations were things like this delightful, small, maintained meadow at a very formal English garden it was called the Gardener's Cottage. You'll notice how it's very clipped hedges. There are roses on the cottage, and just a profusion of meadowy plants gives this sort of this lovely informal sense. And I've seen this in a lot of gardens where the edges are carefully mowed, a trail is mowed through them to give these meadows a sense of definition. Here are some pocket garden inspirations, just small gardens. We don't do quite as much of this. This is also in England as we could here in American gardens, although I'm seeing a lot more of it, especially in this last year where people have been gardening more than ever. But I loved these two small little infill garden patio setting, where these could easily be a little mini meadow. In this case, they're a juga and some other things. But the idea is creating small vignettes that evoke nature. These are more formal, again, in medium plantings, pocket areas here, like this one, a larger one. These could also easily be meadow plantings. For instance, this is getting pretty close to a pocket planting, some black-eyed Susans at the base of a tree and a median. In, I presume, a Maine garden. That's where the Wild Seed Project is based. If we use nature as an inspiration, this is a roadside meadow up at Craigie Gardens with phlox and yarrow and um, coreopsis. We can take those plants, bring them into our landscape, and, take some butterfly weed too, bring them in, mix them up, and keep it maintained so it evokes this sort of wonderful space. These are much larger, that were inspired by our prairies. Pete Aldoff, who is just a brilliant naturalistic landscape designer. This is the Lurie Garden in Colorado, a couple much larger, these are not pocket sized, much larger expanses. Sarah Price in England also used our native perennials. Here, purple coneflower is very evident. There's some, looks like Verbena bonariensis, which is not a native plant to us. But to make it evoke our North American prairies, another view of that same Olympic Park garden on a large scale. But you can imagine making this into a border at a smaller scale, I think. And what I'm going to do here is really talk about what kinds of plants would you like to include, or can you include, and it can be, and how do you do this? I'd like to encourage people to start with an open site. That's easiest if you don't have a lot of weed pressure there. Meadows generally need full sun. They could be wet meadows or dry meadows, and you preferably don't want to have nutrient-rich soil. The process of converting, a weedy grass area to a meadow is a lot more challenging than starting with just bare mulch or bare soil. And usually, if you read about meadow making, you'll run across references to solarization, to smothering, sometimes scraping up that turf with a sod cutter, sometimes using herbicides to kill the turf first. All methods to start with a bare slate if you can do it. Now, if you're just doing it in a container, then you don't have to worry about that. I actually am rather entranced by the idea of very miniature meadows now in containers, and I think I'll spend some time researching that. And so if you are collecting plants, and to put in your meadow, or collecting plugs, and I'll mention here that there are a number of online nurseries now that sell plug mixes that you can pick the plants that you want to get in plugs to create your meadow. And I'll mention Emily Sampson with Patchwork Meadows, who's based in Black Mountain, who also grows plugs and does a lot of work with meadows. And I really applaud her for doing that, and has a wonderful, wonderful website with long lists of plant selections with images for you to take a look at. And I highly recommend that Patchwork Meadows in terms of a resource for locally for plants. But these plug trays, and even going to these catalog sites like Prairie Nursery or Prairie Moon can really help inform what kind of plants that you may want to include. You always want to check about matching your plants to the site conditions, whether it's, again, sunny, dry. Partial shade is not so conducive to meadows, certainly. I tend to use mainly herbaceous perennials, but using grasses as a more historic, or is a more typical meadow with, depending on the type of meadow, you may have 40 to 60% native grasses. In our home landscapes, we tend to want more more showy plants in them or less grasses, but it all depends on the aesthetic that you're wanting to create. There, all sorts of meadows out there. This is one that I've really enjoyed seeing up in Minneapolis. It's a little median planting, and you'll notice that you've got Liatris gayfeather, Coreopsis, common milkweed, phlox, in a very edited little border here. Any of you that have grown common milkweed know that they've carefully maintained this, and they've also artfully edited it so this little planting flows. And that's what I do in my pocket meadow up in the front of the house. I keep an eye on it, and when anything seems to get out of balance to me, too high, too low, looks ratty, I clip it. I'm not constantly, but I keep an eye on it. You don't just let it go. Meadows, like all gardens, require the hand of the gardener to really enhance their look. So here's the pocket meadow, probably 8 or 9 years ago, much smaller than it is today. And the mix of plants is different. The Joe Pye is still there. This Rudbeckia is long gone. We rooted out the golden ragwort. The penstemon has flourished. This year it's absolutely wonderful, but it just emphasizes that these plantings change just like all perennial plantings. And let's talk about some of the plants that you can use. And I like to recommend the commonly used native perennials that you can go out and buy either as container plants, you can buy as plugs, and not worry too much about relatively rare plants you might want to include. Perennial sunflowers are one of my favorites. And you'll notice here that these are, for gardeners, are familiar genera: Asclepias, Coreopsis, Echinacea, Eupatorium, Liatris, penstemons, Pycnanthemum, Rudbeckias, Solidago, Symphyiotrichum, which are asters. Very easy to grow, easy to find, usually perennials. And I think these were on the list, that the handout that Lyndall sent out. In areas that are moister, Joe Pye, which is now Eutropium, cardinal flowers and great blue lobelia can persist, phloxes of varying species, and Monarda, both Monarda didyma and fistulosa are good choices. And Vernonia, ironweed, is also an excellent choice. I like butterfly weed a lot. It's a very tough plant. I just planted one out in the pocket meadow in a bare spot. It can become very large if the soil is rich. It's got deep tap roots, very drought resistant, wonderful plant to attract pollinators of all sorts. Here's the Adrantina, is something that could be a woodland edge and a little bit shady. Penstemons, digitalis is a very genetically diverse species. Mostly you run into Husker's red and other cultivars that have this purplish foliage. Sometimes the flowers are pinker. Liatris, I like to joke, is one of our native genera that went to England, to the Netherlands, got sent back to us, improved varieties, but you generally run into Liatris spicata. This is elegans over at the Botanical Gardens of Asheville. They're not necessarily really long-lived perennials, but great to include within a mix, and easy to obtain just about at any nursery. Coreopsis and purple coneflower, if you're already a perennial gardener, you don't need introduction to these. Native to perennials. This has been a great year for Coreopsis lanceolata. You may have seen it around in different gardens. Mixing that in can be really effective. Common boneset is not a plant that you would necessarily use a lot of in a formal perennial border or even an informal border, but mixed in with other plants here with Rudbeckia tomentosa. It's an absolute magnet for pollinators. And one of the reasons I'm so interested in promoting pocket meadows is because these are pollinator friendly plantings. And that's one of the things I'm really very passionate about. And I'll put in a plug just too for Bee City, USA, which is, or Bee City, Asheville, which is under the aegis of Greenworks, Asheville Greenworks. We have a pollinator habitat we've now established on the new Greenway along the French Broad River. It's in its first year and it's coming along nicely. And so if you park near the Bowen Bridge and start walking down the Greenway, you'll see it. And we're really looking forward to using that more as a way to promote pollinator-friendly plantings. Some other views of that boneset, a bee visiting it, black-eyed Susans, both the perennial species like Fulgida and their cultivars, the more annual species Hirta, both great to include, whether it's a short-term planting of a small meadow or longer term. And again, black-eyed Susans are well known for being great self-sowers. So you have lots of seedlings in good years to move around and put in other parts of your landscape or share with friends and replace little bare spots in your meadow mix. Goldenrods and yarrows. The one that fireworks is the one that you probably will run into most at a nursery, but lots of wonderful goldenrod species. Aromatic goldenrod is one that I like, a little harder to find. I mentioned sunflowers already. This is a swamp sunflower, which gets very, very big. What I would mention is that a number of these plants like silphiums and helianthus and the asters benefit from this a mid-June cutting back to keep their size in check, so they don't flop over quite as much. Not all plants respond well to that kind of early summer pruning, but helianthus and asters do in particular. We've got a couple of different great aster species that you can use. New England aster, New York aster, aromatic aster, all pollinator magnets in the fall. I like aromatic aster a lot. It's a really beautiful plant, and in October it can just be covered over with bees and butterflies sometimes. Ironweed and Joe Pye are also easy to include. Ironweed seeds around. You can in a way that you can then move those plants around or just eliminate them if you don't want too many large specimens. There are some smaller species and species from the central US that can be used as well. Joe Pye, there are a lot of small selections that are a little bit more human scale than the tall ditch denizens that we see a lot roadside. This is a small cultivar, probably dubium, that was in a parking lot planting that I saw. And I really love this particular planting because it was a very small little rain garden in this parking lot of the Performing Arts Center in Highlands, but it was so graceful and it was really, really lovely. Blue Star, mine is about to come in flower in the front. There's some number of different Amsonia species you can use. Very nice, wonderful fall color as well. I mentioned bee balm. This is fish delosa, but the didymma, which is red, if you have a wetter spot, it can flourish as well. I used a lot of Indian grass down in the Piedmont meadow, and also in the larger meadows at the Botanical Garden that we worked with. It also self-seeds, so that's also something to keep in mind. Little blue stem, if you go over to the UNCA campus, near where the Bee Hotel is, there's a very nice meadow planting, a pollinator-friendly planting that has little blue stem and panicum in it, and it's a really attractive patch as you go up towards or past the entrance or at the entrance to campus. There's also another meadow, let's see, around near the Student Union that is equally nice. Not quite, it tends a little bit to be more informal, but depending on the time of year is really striking. So let me just finish up here with a fairly short example of what we did to create the pocket meadow in the front of our landscape here in Asheville. My husband's also a botanist, so we're plant people. We bought this house as a second house, or second home, because we loved Asheville. And we thought, oh, we're going to have a low maintenance garden. Well, two plant people and two gardeners it's still low maintenance, but you don't want to drive up. This used to be a gravel driveway. You don't want to drive up and look at this. This is just awful. So we got to work. This was in 2009, shortly after we bought the house, a year after that. You can see we covered over the gravel with the mulch, started laying things out, redoing the walkway a bit. We planted this with some sedums, so we were ready to get to work. This is the site of the pocket meadow. This must have been privet or something that Tim cut out of the next to the driveway. I'm kind of forgotten now. It's been, but this is the site we were working with. And I always thought there was room for more. We went and got different kinds of plants. You can see that our gardening companion here at that time, this was Mocha. We now have Woody. We acquire plants in various places, a lot of native plant sales at BGA, the nurseries. I mentioned Emily's business earlier. Painters is another one that does more and more perennials, lots of smaller nurseries who sell at the tailgate markets and elsewhere. What I did in this meadow, and I often recommend this, is putting in plants because they are easy to establish. Seeding meadows is really quite challenging in a lot of ways. And gradually adding more plants, seeing what worked. You see this in this particular rendition, it's just getting a little bit bigger. By summer of 2011, you can see that this was a fairly established plant. These are raised bed vegetable beds with herbs over here that got added as well. That's a whole nother program, but gradually here in September, much higher. Here are some zizias, golden Alexanders that actually have disappeared. I don't know why they didn't persist, maybe not enough sun in 2014. Here, late July 2017. And this was a really wonderful kind of welcome home to drive in, pull into the driveway and see this profusion of Rudbeckia, This is Silphium, Joe Pye, purple coneflowers. Now there's a big Amsonia right there. So it's something that's always changing. And so what I'll do is now we can spend some time with questions. I'll just mention that because this meadow is in our pocket meadow is right in front of the house, and we look out at it through our glass storm door, there's a lot of play in it to be looking at it from all sides. And so it's something that you want to consider as where you're thinking about putting in a meadow. Where do you see it from? How you can kind of contain it one way or another, or how small would you like it to be? It could be around a mailbox, or if we had a median strip or along a curbside. Those can all be excellent spots for this. If you go onto my blog here, Natural Gardening, and search under pocket meadows or pollinator friendly gardening, you'll find, I'll just show you how that would work. Oops. You can go to the archive, and there's a search function over here that you can just put in a search and find. And you'll notice, like here, you can also look at PDF versions of programs. Is the pollinator friendly garden one here, and other plant lists. Let's see here. So I'm trying to stop sharing. Okay. So with that, let's see, we've got a number of, it looks like Q&A and also folks in chat.
Yeah, we sure do, Lisa. Let's start out with Kathy. She wants to know, what plants do you recommend if you have a huge number of deer grazing in your yard?
Well, the ones they don't eat. Plants that deer don't want to eat is a relative kind of thing to think about as a gardener. It all depends on how hungry the deer are. Is it a droughty year where they really need the moisture from the plants? The rule of thumb would be that more aromatic plants, salvias, aromatic asters, are going to be less attractive to deer. The succulent things like hostas, or your vegetables, are going to be magnets. For meadows, I think I would be really recommending trial and error in terms of keeping an eye on what in your perennial borders, are they coming in and eating up all your purple coneflowers? Well, don't use that. The rabbits love Rudbeckia. Probably deer love them too, so that may not be a good choice, but perhaps then that bee balm, or as I said, aromatic aster, anything in the mint family bone set's probably a good one to use that they wouldn't eat. But I'm afraid I can't be more helpful. There are long lists of plants that are supposedly deer resistant, but that's again all relative.
Okay, and Dan had a question along the same lines, but she said she has to cope with the rabbits. So would you say probably the same thing, of just to see what they're eating and try to work with it, of planting something that's more,
and just know that it's going to change year to year, whether and how with drought conditions. And just really pay attention to what they're eating. And there's some, I like to joke a little bit with woodchucks and rabbits, and I thankfully have not had to garden too much with deer, but is using sort of super attractive sort of plants like vegetables is sort of over in some other area to keep them occupied in years like this spring and last spring that have been quite moderate in temperature, if not downright cool. There's a lot of green. There's a lot of grass that's lush down on our back slope, so the woodchuck stays back there and doesn't creep up front. But in contrast, our neighbors, they're having their vegetables just mowed down with rabbits because they had a rabbit explosion just down the block. So basically same answer. Rabbits are challenging.
Yeah, you definitely have to work with it. And I understand that.
Yeah.
Allison was wondering is how do you put in a pocket meadow into a site that is currently in grass?
It depends on the kind of grass it is and how maintained it's been as turf. As I mentioned in the program, most recommendations will have you doing away with the turf before you start planting, whether it's plugs or whether it's plants or whether it's you're attempting to seed. If you have a suspicion that your scruffy lawn might have some potential to, as you can see what it happens when you stop mowing, as the pollinator friendly practices are include this year. We really heard a lot about no mow May. You can let it go and just see what's there. And if it's not too horrifying, or you have a lot of clover, then you can start plugging in plants and see if you can tweak it towards something that you find aesthetically pleasing as a meadow. But that's going to be challenging. If you have really tough, competitive grasses in there, it's going to be very hard because particularly weedy grasses, the pasture grasses like Johnson grass, fescue isn't so incredibly competitive, but if it's really dense, you're going to have trouble. The perennials you put in, you're going to have trouble with that. So it depends on what you're starting with and how robust that lawn is.
That makes sense. Melissa wanted to know is how did you successfully get rid of pivot?
Privet's hard, you know. I'll be careful about what I say about this, but we are very organic in our methods. But if you want it, privet will resprout. So we cut it, paint it with herbicide, the stump with herbicide to kill it. So, and if you have a lot of privet, if it's small, you can pull it, but it's really hard to control. And that's true of a number of fairly invasive plants.
Yeah, unfortunately, sometimes that's what you have to do to get rid of it. Alice wanted to know is what type of herbicide to use on that.
Well, again, what we use is glyphosate, which is still striking me as the least noxious of the options out there. There's some really horrible herbicide. I mean, really very powerful herbicides. And I personally haven't been convinced by some of with the studies that have been reported that it's something I shouldn't let Tim use or our dog get close to.
Yeah, I understand that. Donna wanted to know, she likes how your front garden goes right up to the curb. And she was wondering if there are any restrictions on planting to the very edge that someone should be aware of, you know, such as right away and things of that nature. If you have to go to the town or to the city to ask first.
Well, we're in, I'm not really aware of that. Certainly there have been issues nationwide with ordinances for developments for towns in terms of what what front yard plantings can be, so to speak, and a lot of pushback on vegetable gardens, for example. And if you happen to be in a community where there, and I'm not familiar with too many constraints here in North Carolina in communities, except for gated communities and sort of developments, well, really that have homeowners associations may be preventing you from gardening to the curb. We live in Montford, which is a historic district near downtown, and there's so many gardens that go all the way up to the curb. That's perfectly acceptable.
Okay.
So I would just check, and if I have worked with, talked with folks who are in patio homes that are very constrained about what they can plant, but I think just doing a bit of investigation should take care of that.
Okay, great. Well, that was the last of our questions. Andrea just had a mention that if anybody wants to look for plants that deers don't care about, to check out the NC Plant Toolbox, which is a great resource.
Good idea. Yeah.
So check that out in her. It's plants.ces.ncsu.edu. So that was a good recommendation. So thank you, Andrea. Okay. Oh,
also the extension service and will also have good lists, not just North Carolina's, but also surrounding states. So.
Yeah, they're a great place to look for resources, definitely. And I want to thank you so much, Lisa, for coming today. And I'm kind of jazzed up to think about what I'm going to be doing with that sunny location in my garden. That it's going to have a meadow soon.
Yeah, well, it's really so much fun. And what's nice about having an informal perennial border is you can let it feel loose and kind of evoke nature, which is what has been my intent in that particular landscape. So
yeah, that is great. So thank you so much. And I really hope that you might come in person next year.
Oh, wouldn't that be nice? Yeah.
Yeah, that'd be a different feeling.
Right. And I know that many of your programs are more focused on vegetables. And I certainly want to wish everyone a good vegetable gardening season, as well as perennials in their garden. So far, at least we've got the droughty conditions seem to have broken for now. So we've got some rain. So that's great. So,
yeah, that is. It's good. And everything is popping. So that's the nice part. So thank you.
Yeah, good wishes to everyone for a good gardening season.
Thank you. I'd also like to thank Lisa Presley, because she's always behind the scenes in our Zoom room, making sure everything is going well. So thank you, Lisa. And gardeners, just a reminder, our next sowing circle is July 10th at 10 a.m. We've got John Bowen's going to be teaching us about propagation class. So just register at Black Mountain Library events page. And just a reminder that our seed library was made possible by donations to the Friends of the Black Mountain Library. And this is a gardening gift for all of you. So take advantage of everything we have to offer between the seeds, the classes, the books. But the best special part of this is that you're a member of our gardening community, and we really appreciate you. So remember to support our local libraries. And thank you all for coming, and we'll see you next month. Take care.